Hello, this is Dr. Adam J. Bach. In this short audio presentation, we're going to continue our conversation about competitive strategy. Our key topics are going to be a little deeper dive into the nature of competitive strategy, and specifically the problem with being first to market and why it's not in and of itself a long-term sustainable competitive advantage. Michael Porter identified a limited set of possible competitive strategies based on very specific competitive advantages. Just to review, the two core competitive strategies are cost and differentiation. Porter also identified two scopes for competitive positioning, either a focused scope or a broad industry-wide scope. This leads to four potential advantages or positions within an industry. Now, some practitioners and academics like to say there's only two strategies, cost and differentiation. Some argue that there are three: cost, differentiation, and then focus. But I think it's useful to recognize that the matrix clearly identifies four different ways to be positioned. The key thing to remember about competitive strategy is that you can't easily do both. So let's think about this a little bit more. If we're going to compete as a low-cost competitor, what that means is that we are constantly going to be investing to drive down our costs while meeting minimum customer needs. Our goal here is ultimately to be able to generate lower prices. Remember that cost is not the same thing as price. We could have the lowest cost structure in the industry, but we could choose to charge whatever prices we want. But clearly, if we are the lowest cost competitor, then in theory we could bring our prices down, and because we'll be priced lower than competition and still meet minimum quality requirements, we should be able to generate more sales. That is, higher volume of sales. And if we're doing that, that should enable us to then continue to drive our costs down because of the economies of scale that we'll have. This is a cycle in which we are constantly increasing our economy of scale from volume, which allows us to reinvest in driving costs down further, which then should allow us to reduce prices. On the other side, we could be a differentiated competitor. In this situation, the idea is that we take the profits that we generate and we constantly invest to create better products or services for our customers who need more than the minimum, right? So these are not the same customers that are looking to simply meet the minimum requirement at the lowest possible cost. These are customers who are prepared to pay a little bit more for something extra. So here we're going to be charging a higher price. We'll generate a lower volume than our low-cost competitors will, but we'll still be generating good profits because our prices are higher. And then we reinvest those profits in further improving our products or services to maintain our advantage. It is really important to understand how hard it is to do both of these at the same time. And the reason is because if you try to do both, you're likely to get stuck in the middle. That is, if you're attempting to be competitor C, as shown here, it means that while company A is constantly investing in cost reduction and economies of scale, and competitor B is constantly investing, for example, in R&D to improve product quality, you're trying to invest in both, which means that you can't possibly be investing as much in either one of these areas as A or B is. You're not investing as much as A in driving costs down, and you're not investing as much as B in building product quality and service capabilities. And that means that you are vulnerable to losing customers to both of these companies. And for 50 years, academic researchers and management have identified over and over and over again how companies that have tried to do both have lost to companies that are doing one or the other. So that gives us a sense of why it's so important to clearly identify which competitive strategy your organization is going to utilize. But a very common argument that new entrepreneurs make is that they will succeed by being first to market. And this is a very common assumption made by entrepreneurs, and at face value it sounds great. We'll be first, customers will buy our products first, and we will therefore gain a foothold in the market and be successful. And that is a possibility. If you are first to market, there is potentially an advantage to that. But you really need to understand that it is a short-term advantage, and it can be a very costly investment to make. Being first to market means you're likely to have a high cost of building a supplier network, high cost of setting up distribution and support because other organizations aren't going to have familiarity with how your product or service works. You'll probably have to spend a lot of money educating customers because they'll have never seen something like this before. There's likely to be a high cost of fixing errors because any mistake you make, it will be obvious that it was your mistake and it will reflect badly on your brand. And broadly speaking, there will be a high cost of brand building anyway. This isn't to say that being first to market is necessarily a bad thing, but it's usually an expensive proposition. It requires a higher investment. On the other hand, being a fast follower has lots and lots of advantages. For example, if you are following another company into an industry with a similar product, it means that there are suppliers already identified and vetted. You can quickly find out who they are and which ones have the products and services that you need in order to create what your products and services will do. You probably can copy distribution and support systems from the first mover, which means that you can pay attention to the things that went right and wrong, and you can choose to avoid some of those errors. That first mover will have already educated customers. They may have a large-scale marketing plan, which you might think is disadvantageous, but in fact what it means is that lots and lots of customers know about the product or service already, and some of them probably didn't like or didn't want what the first mover was providing. The first mover has probably committed all of the major errors that are going to be made, and you can choose to ignore those or get past them. And brand building will be done through comparison. You can say, look, company A already does this, and we do it differently. And that kind of brand building is much easier to do than brand building in a vacuum. Now, I want to give you an example of this because many people are under the impression that first movers always win and that there's these enormous advantages. And in fact, we sometimes get misimpressions about which companies are winners versus which companies are first movers. So, for example, let's talk about the first to markets or winners in a series of consumer products that you're very, very familiar with. So first of all, we might ask MP3 players are all pretty much gone at this point, but this was a revolution in digital technology. And a good question is, who won the MP3 wars? Which was the company that had the dominant MP3 player? And the answer to that question, you probably should know, although you may not. You've probably used your phone for MP3s now. But there's no question that that company was Apple with the iPod that was launched in 2001. And for a while, the iPod had something like 80% or 85% market share. So let's follow on with this with the smartphone. Which was the company that sort of won the smartphone? And we might argue that now, with the advent of the Android operating system, Google has developed a significant market dominance. But in many ways, the real winner of the smartphone battle was actually also Apple with the launch of the iPhone in 2007. And you might consider the fact that Google doesn't make all of the phones that run Android, and it obviously benefits from the use of the operating system. But in terms of the single most purchased smartphones for many, many years, it was Apple. We can then ask the same question about tablet computers, and you might already have figured out where this particular slide is going. Yes, there are many tablet computers out there right now, but the one that really made it all work was, of course, the Apple iPad, which was launched in 2010. And now we can take a step back and think about, beyond the products themselves, who was the company that really won originally the digital music scene. Now, today, in 2020, as I'm recording this presentation, digital MP3 downloads have given way to streaming, and there's an active war going on between a variety of companies. But in terms of the company that made buying digital music legal and successful originally, you might realize where this is going. It was, of course, Apple's iTunes, which was launched in 2004. And so all of this might lead you to think, well, this just goes to show how innovative Apple really is. And you might be under the impression that these products were in fact also the first to market. But the truth of the matter is a little different. So let's walk through this. My guess is you don't know who the first MP3 player was, what the very first MP3 player was. You might, but my guess is you don't. And in fact, the Apple iPod was not the first MP3 player. That was the Cyan Information Systems MP-Man, launched in 1997. And I am sure you've never even heard of that, much less the company that built it. And on the smartphone side of things, the Apple iPhone was clearly not the first smartphone, and we have to go back even further than the Cyan MP-Man defined the first smartphone. That was actually IBM's Simon Personal Communicator, which was originally launched in 1992. And in fact, the Apple iPad was not the first tablet computer. That goes to the Microsoft tablet back in 2000, which is now making a bit of a comeback 20 years later, but at the time it was not very successful. And of course, iTunes was not the first mechanism for buying digital music legally. Many of you might be aware of Napster, which was an illegal system. But in fact, the first online digital music system for buying MP3s legally was Rhapsody. The bottom line is that being first to market is not necessarily a guarantee of successful innovation. And very often the winners in really novel technology fields are the ones who watch the first to market players stumble as they make mistakes or don't meet market needs, and who then launch a product that much more clearly matches what customers are actually looking for. First to market by itself is not a sustainable long-term competitive advantage. You can convert it to long-term advantage if you can take advantage of economies of scale, leverage network effects, build a unique brand identity, create supplier or customer lock-in, or otherwise use that first mover advantage to establish a defensible strategic position. But you have to do at least one, if not more than one of these, in order to give yourself a shot at long-term sustainable advantage. So I hope this has given you a little more to think about in terms of competitive positioning, competitive strategy, and the issues around first to market.